Can everyone hear me okay with this mic? Awesome sauce. So the main reason why I'm wanting everyone to get started on this now is because in order to make the internet reliable, they've had to slow it down. And but so just as long as everyone kind of gets a jump on this, and if you haven't started cloning Kubernetes, the core repo, also start that now. You'll have plenty of time. Are there questions?
Looks like it's going to take some time even to install Go or install get kind from there. So how long do we have to go to this stuff?
So the comment was that it looks like it might take some time to go get kind. So, all right. Sorry?
Like even the Go binary is like 100 megabytes or something.
Yeah, it's, we will have time because we're going to start working with this after lunch. And right now, we are only going to do the code walkthrough. So we should be okay, don't worry. But that's why this slide is up right now.
Getting a 403 and pulling kind from the release.
I just got IO.
Not like go get right, you can actually download the release from the release page.
If you need a hand, if you need some help, raise your hand. Yeah, sure. But sure. Yes. Thank you. I think the question was over there. Yeah, if you.
Should there be a semicolon there?
Is this command working?
It's just giving me an IO. It's failing.
Oh, you mean a semicolon after the on? Okay, yeah. Yeah, for sure. How's this?
Perfect.
All right. Yay, group debugging.
For anybody who doesn't have a link to the slides, if you're in the Slack group, I pinned that slide deck link. Just go to the Slack contributor summit and you can get the link. Yay!
Okay.
Yeah, I just pinned it because I was scrambling around very quickly.
All right, so this will be the last presentation before lunch. So I'm looking forward to this one. Let me scroll back. Right. Present. All right. Who here has poked around the Kubernetes code base? Who here has opened an issue against Kubernetes? Who here has opened a pull request against Kubernetes? All right, getting fewer. Who here has successfully merged one of their pull requests against Kubernetes? Well done, sir. Well done. Who here has taken a look at the Kubernetes core repository and gotten a little scared? I have. This particular introduction is a brief overview of where all the interesting parts in the Kubernetes core repository live. There are a couple of really common gotchas that not everyone is aware of, and my hope is that with this, that after today, you will not stumble over this. When we say Kubernetes, we often mean the Kubernetes monolith. Kubernetes is a huge repository with many, many areas, and as Bob already mentioned earlier, lots and lots of our community groups own different parts of the code base, and somehow the code has to talk to itself, and all the owners have to talk to each other, and it can be really, really difficult to get your bearings. The other thing when we say Kubernetes is we are talking about Kubernetes. On GitHub, Kubernetes is the org. Kubernetes, or as we often refer to as KK, because we're lazy and we can't be bothered, is the core repository. This is where most of the Kubernetes code lives. This is where all the binaries that you use as an end user get made. And contrary to expectations, this is also where a lot of the client code lives, which is fun and interesting. But despite this, I'm going to be bouncing between the presentation and the code for most of the rest of this hour. But keep in mind that there are still parts of Kubernetes, the ecosystem, that do not live in the core repository. Most notably, our test infra does not live in Kubernetes core. I do not know where the pointer went. I think maybe Chris snagged it. But on the bottom right, you can see the Kubernetes test infra. That is where all the automation lives that makes the bots work and makes your pull requests work and puts all the labels onto things and merges your pull request when you're done. The Kubernetes website is where we do all of our documentation, or a lot of our documentation, I should say. And you are already getting kind from Kubernetes SIGs. There are a total of 190 repositories in the entire ecosystem. That's the bad news. The good news is there's lots of places to get involved. And without further ado, I am going to go and head over to Kubernetes. And actually, let me go ahead and make sure that I'm all set up for this. I have notes. All right. So, who can see my screen? And do I need to make it bigger? How's that? Great. Okay. So here we are, and it doesn't look so bad, right? There's a few folders, and then there's a bunch of changelog MDs that probably mostly have words in them about the changelog. And then there's a make file, a Go mod. Actually, Kubernetes is using Go modules as of the last few releases. Let's start on the top. Somebody's really excited about Go modules. Yay! So the .github folder is administrative. This is where we have our issue templates. Unless you were involved with contributor experience, you probably will not necessarily be super interested in this part of the repo. Go deps, these are literally licenses and owner's files. Again, administrative. Now, the next folder is interesting. Let's go back to the presentation and make sure we track API. All right. The API folder is interesting because it looks like this is where the Kubernetes API lives. That's not true. I'm sorry. This is not where you find the API primitives. This is, this entire folder is actually auto-generated. And what happens here is the only thing that lives here are the rules under which the Kubernetes APIs get generated. You will also see this is not a super active folder. Last year, 3 months ago, well, there was a violation exception added 3 days ago. But if you want to deal with API objects, this is not the place to look. So I've talked a lot about where things are. Where things aren't, and not a whole lot about where things are. This will be a theme for this presentation. In the build folder, there are a lot of tools. This kind of leads me back to, do not believe this README. So it's a huge community repo. We have thousands of contributors all over the world. Everyone and their uncle have decided that, well, all right, I don't want to misrepresent things. In this folder, in the build folder, and there's another folder much like it, there live helper scripts. Things for specific uses, things that get used by automation and tooling, things that you might use if that is your situation and your setup. We welcome anyone who wants to come in here and clean up. We welcome anyone who can fix the documentation on this. Some of this is absolutely valid and absolutely useful, and you will run into some of these shell scripts. For example, when you're running a cherry pick script for certain phases in the release. When you're running test scripts, some of them live in here. I was going to show you one of these test scripts in my demonstration earlier before the network failed me. So I apologize about that. The next folder is cluster. This one, too, is a historic folder. You will see things like Juju. I remember meeting one person who was provisioning clusters with Juju. So this is basically where cluster provisioning code used to live. A lot of that code is now provider-specific and lives in Kubernetes SIGs. And many of these things are, some of them are being used by some folks, but they're they're mostly here for historic reasons. All right, so let's go back and see where we're at. We talked about build, we talked about cluster, and now we are going to talk about the command folder. This one is actually going to be interesting. By the way, do we have questions so far? There's a question in the back. We're going to give you a mic so everyone can hear your question.
I vaguely remember reading somewhere in some README something about building with make versus Bazel. What's that all about?
So, yes. The answer is yes. You can do both. So Bazel is the open source version of an internal Google tool called Blaze. And what Bazel does, I believe, is it builds your dependencies from the ground up for your system in place. So where a make script can fail because you don't have the correct dependencies, Bazel at least attempts to just make all of those for you. That is my very uninformed, bird's eye view understanding of the difference. Both are valid ways to go. Thanks for the question. Now, where were we? We were in the command folder. All right. So here are some things that should look familiar. kubeadm, kubectl, kubelet. Let's look at the kubelet. Here's kubelet.go. This is where the Kubernetes binaries live. This is the main compiling code for the kubelet. Couple of gotchas again. So there's kubeproxy, kubescheduler. If you look at where is it? Left. So here's a Kube API server. KubeADM. KubeMark is, I believe, it is a thing that used to be used for testing. Yeah, hollow node. This is this is code that is meant to bring up cluster-like objects so that you can run tests against them without using a whole bunch of machines. Next, we have another historic folder, docs. As I already mentioned, the Kubernetes docs don't live here. There's a git ignore, there's a build file that got modified 2 years ago, and an owners file. We will talk about owners files later this afternoon. But in the meantime, the place where you would find docs is at Kubernetes/website. This is where the API docs get built, and this is also where the reference documentation lives, I believe. The Kubernetes documentation folks have their very own SIG, so if you're into writing docs and making things accessible for users, this is the place to start. I am also told that they have an excellent onboarding process as a SIG. So again, this folder is mostly historic. I will say this word, historic, a bunch of times. Our next place is the hack directory. I circled the build directory that I already talked about. Some of the utility scripts live in build, others live in hack. There is no rhyme or reason. But that's okay, because now you know that this is where things were. So here's the golint failure script that I was going to show you all earlier when I did my demo. Here is the cherry pick script that I talked about. These are some scripts that you might use given certain situations. Test scripts. I encourage everyone to poke around in this folder and see what they can find and see what is useful. We desperately need some bash wizards that can fix our many, many helper scripts. So far, we have learned, here's where the commands are. Here's a whole bunch of historical things that are no longer really of interest. And here's where the helper scripts live. Next, the logo folder. It is tiny. Its purpose is obvious. This is where the Kubernetes logo is hosted, and that is all it does. It is absolutely up to date, useful and relevant, but not necessarily if you want to hack on things. All right. Questions so far before I delve into the package folder? Cool. Package. All right, so the first thing that you see in the Kubernetes package folder are the top two folders. They are called API and APIs. Anyone have an idea why that is? I hear mumblings. Yes! Historical reasons, very good. It turns out that the API folder is the original Kubernetes API. It's got pods, it's got services, and I believe persistent volumes. Look at that. And then people kind of saw Kubernetes take off, and they're like, oh, it does all these things. Wouldn't it be cool if it did all these other things as well? And so the APIs folder was born. And this is where you find things like admission registration and authentication and events and RBAC and all these other really cool things that Kubernetes does for us. I see a question in the back.
I have a feeling you're going to answer it. So why didn't they just integrate into the API folder?
You know what? That's a really good question. And I'm not entirely certain. I believe it has something to do with the way that the objects are built and depend on each other. So I'm sort of going to answer that, but it might actually confuse you further. So the next thing that I'm going to do, so they actually kind of did this. Before we go on with a package folder where a lot of exciting code lives, we have to take a shortcut to the staging folder. Let me take a step back. We have a huge mono repo. We have so much code living in Kubernetes core that it takes multiple community groups to manage it, to review it. We have owners' files all over the repository, and the folks in those owners' files only are code owners of that part of Kubernetes. There are very few people who are top-level owners. They exist. They have superpowers. I am not one of them. So on the top-level Kubernetes, we are going to go into this staging folder. When I first heard that there was a staging folder, I was thinking in terms of CI. I'm like, okay, so I'm going to deploy to staging first. This is not that. This is completely not that. What this is the staging folder exists with the goal of breaking up the monolith. That is its main purpose. So what is happening here is we are staging a lot of code for eventually living on its own, on their own repository. If you look at the README, there are a whole lot of things, of concepts, binaries, commands that have plans to be broken out of the monolith. So I'm going to go into the most common example, and that is Kubernetes client Go. Who here has used the Go client for Kubernetes? Who here has gotten confused because there is an actual client Go repository in the Kubernetes org? Yeah, so this repository, Kubernetes/client Go, currently is a lie. You can't do anything with it. Well, you can do some things with it. But what this is, it is a mirror repository of code that lives in Kubernetes core in the staging source K8s.io client Go. Let me split up my screen so that you can see them next to each other, maybe. Here we are. So on the left is Kubernetes, staging, source, K8s.io, client Go. And on the right, you have the regular Go client for Kubernetes. There are a number of these mirror repositories. Some of them will have a warning on the top level README that says, please don't try to contribute here. All code should go into Kubernetes core. Others, I believe, including the Go client, don't do that. They just kind of, so in the staging folder, there isn't even a README, and on the client Go, it says, oh yeah, this is the Go client. They just, yeah. So This is your warning. Who has gotten tripped up by this, by the way? Yeah.
Which is the source of truth?
The current source of truth is Kubernetes /staging/source/. So it's this one on the left. Because if you notice, actually, they are still being mirrored pretty much exactly. If you look at the KCI robot right here, it says merge pull request number 85305. And that is the exact same pull request that is merged into client Go, even though like client Go doesn't even have that many pull requests against it. Question?
So at a dot release, why wouldn't you just move it all over to the new location? I'm sure it's impossible, but I don't know why.
There are a lot of dependencies, right? There are a lot of interdependencies, and they all have to be solved before this happens. And to be entirely truthful with you, I cannot give you a good answer for this because most of the time when I talk to maintainers who are in charge of this migration, they don't want to talk about it. So, but I will tell you that I have seen code move from the core repository to the staging folder in preparation for breaking out. So my hope is that things are happening and you can be part of it. That is an excellent question and not one I am prepared to answer because I don't believe so. The other really cool thing is that in the Kubernetes core repository, you will see imports that reference these mirror repositories, which I don't even know how that works, and Go definitely says you shouldn't do that, but it is definitely a thing that happens. So that's also incredibly fun. So client Go is just one example of these mirrored repositories. Let's go back and I'll make this full again. So in summary, whoops, I haven't even talked about the APIs yet. Let me go back to that. But in summary, a lot of stuff will live under Kubernetes package, and a lot of stuff will live under Kubernetes staging. And we will return to the staging folder and talk a little bit more about that. Excuse me. So I gave clients Go as an example. Back to your question about the APIs. Here in Kubernetes IO, in the staging repository, keep in mind we're in the staging right now, the top level folder says API. You got your wish. It all lives in one place now. The former core API has its own place under core/v1. If you poke around in here, you will find under register, I believe it's in register, you will find that here, we can totally look at these things, add known types, node, event, list, secret, pod. So here are some pod, let me find, let's see, pod, exactly. So add known types. This is where we're adding all of the Kubernetes raw types. And it is all part of one API in this location. To summarize, because this is another of the gotchas, it's like, which API am I dealing with and where does the API live? In the package folder, you have /API, and you will find those types in the staging folder under API core v1, and what was formerly APIs is now just API, which incorporates the old types. Anyone still confused? All right. Let me try and say it in a different way. Nope, I don't want to go there. There. Over here, in the Kubernetes package folder, we have code that refers to pods, services, the original API, and we have an APIs folder that contains everything else. Nowadays, we think of all of those as one API. Because of the migration efforts, under Kubernetes staging source, we now have all of this combined in one top-level API folder. If you are looking for the types that over here in package are in the old API folder, they live right here. And you can't see it from the file names, but if you actually look at the register, if you actually look at the types that are contained inside, like right here, if you look at types.go or register.go, you will find the original Kubernetes API types. Yeah, this might also be something that you have to look at by yourself a couple times or discuss it or talk it back at someone, which we're all friends here, so I encourage everyone to do that. Cool. Present. So if you look at the file structure next to each other, you will see that the package APIs looks very, very similar to the API folder. But if you're confused because of the naming, this is why. Okay, we've done that. We covered that. Let's look into a couple more other things. Yeah?
Which one is actually used when building the Kubernetes, like Binaries? Out of the 20 folders.
So when we build Kubernetes, we actually, so these APIs are actually just definitions and registration of API types. So you don't build those. It is literally like, this is API machinery kind of stuff. I will get back to the rest of your question, I hope, as we go on. Sorry, the question was, where do we build the Kubernetes binaries? And we are actually going to do that in a later demo. So let's look at a couple more of the folders in package, because there's some interesting stuff in here. So here's some of these folders are going to be extremely descriptive, and other ones are descriptive and you think they are one thing and they're really, really not. But auth is what you think it does. It talks about authorization inside a Kubernetes cluster. Capabilities has something to do with, I can't actually remember at this point. Oh yeah, manages system level capabilities. It says right here. I feel terrible for reading something out that you could have read yourself. Client used to contain client code, no longer does. We already talked about client Go. Cloud provider is another one of those historic leftovers. We have many different cloud providers. They have their own SIG. Each cloud provider actually has their own forked repository in Kubernetes SIGs that you can go check out. So this is what it's telling you. It's deprecated, and a lot of these cloud providers live somewhere else. They have enhancements. This doc hasn't been updated in quite a while. Controller is cool. This is what runs all the objects. So here you'll see just by the description of what's going on. Here's the cron job. We can take a look in there. Here's the cron job controller. There's some documentation. And this is basically where the objects get made. Volume, service, all of this should look pretty, what's the word? I'm missing a word. Familiar, thank you. This should look pretty familiar to folks, so this is the controller code. Let's go back to package. Credential provider. This one is basically what it says on the box, but this is a little bit of extra code that you might need so you can use Kubernetes from private repositories. If your code does not have access to public GitHub, here are some things that people have worked on to make it work on their own private GitHub or whatever they use. I wouldn't know because it's private. Feature. This is for feature gating. Feature gating is important when we are trying out new features that are in alpha. Feature gating is important when we're not sure if something's going to break things. This is where that happens. I actually have zero idea what field path does. And there's a doc. And all right, it supplies methods for extracting fields. All right, cool. So I'm going to go ahead and just talk about a few more of these. This one, Kube API server, is where all the things live that the API server needs to run. Admission, authentication, authorization. Kubectl, kubelet, these are, we all know what these are. And this is some of the command code.
What's the difference between this directory and the command directory?
What's the difference? This is where all the logic lives. The command directory literally has the main.go file for each of these binaries.
That's it?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Yep. Oh, I thought you were coming up and grabbing a microphone and correcting me. This is entirely possible. I am not by any means the super authority on all things Kubernetes core. If you all want to learn more, go get involved with SIGs, go dig into the code, go work on it. No one knows all the things, with like maybe a handful of exceptions. Actually, I'm willing to bet no one knows all the things because there's so many separate niches and like provider-specific areas of this code that it's gotten quite out of hand. Let's see. Now, where was I? Let's see. I have been talking about the folders in the Kubernetes package directory. Cloud provider, controller. I even had a slide for you. Credential provider, features, Kube API server, Kubectl, kubelet. KubeMark, I again mentioned this was an attempt that I'm not sure what the state is, to have a fake Kubernetes cluster for the purposes of metrics, generating metrics and compare and getting information. So the master directory is left over for historic reasons. The API The Kubernetes control plane used to be referred to as the master plane, and it is now the Kubernetes control plane. I'm not sure why it's still sticking around, probably because of some redirects and dependencies. But let me assure you that where you want to be is Kube API server, not the master folder. Again, just be aware. We are still in the package directory, and I keep doing this, and it's not what I want. So who here has used kubectl, Kubectl? The printers folder is actually where a lot of the code lives that makes your kubectl output look pretty. So this is what makes everything look like a nice table and not a jumble of logs. We all love logs. It's great. Cool. Let's get back here. Printers. Proxy has code related to kube proxy. I am personally not super familiar with kube proxy on, a personal, I'm not really on a first name basis with it, but if this is you, this is where you would find that. Quota. This one contains logic for things like resource and memory quota. It's not a super enormous folder, but we do want to make sure we have it because it's important for things like storage.
Why is this not in the controllers folder?
I have no idea.
There's a quotas control.
I really don't know. Somebody decided it was a good idea to put it here at some point. Who here is on an operations team for a large system that's, more than 3 years old? So what you see here, why doesn't this live here? Well, it would be great if it did, but it currently doesn't because it organically grew from a thing. One thing led to another, and now it's here, and here we are. And there are always efforts to clean up the code. There's a whole code cleanup label, and I really encourage everyone who sees something that they don't like. This is actually a great opportunity, right? So many skeletons, so many things that don't make sense. Go ahead and get involved. Let's see. We have 15 minutes until lunch, so that is all the time we're going to spend on this. Registry. This is storage related. Scheduler. This is where logic for scheduling pods lives. Let's take a quick peek. This is fairly busy, fairly involved. There's a whole SIG called SIG scheduling that is involved with this part of the code base. If this is you, get involved. Security, similar thing, what it says on the box. What kind of security resources do we have? And security context is about what security resources we are using. Let me get back to my present. Service account has logic, for service accounts. SSH is not actually what you think it is. Again, if we're going to peek in here, SSH has something to do with metrics. It's not really authorization related. I'm unsure why it's called SSH. So these are just a couple of the things that you might find that don't make a whole lot of sense. Util is another helper script folder. Volume is related to storage again, persistent volumes. Windows. This is some of the places where attempts at making Kubernetes work with Windows containers. Who here works on Windows? Oh my gosh. You are brave people. No, this is great. I love it. I love it. There's a whole SIG Windows for you, just for you, that involves Kubernetes, Windows, and everything related. I very much hope that they will be at the SIG meet and greet, because that will be the SIG for you. All right, so this was the biggest directory in the Kubernetes repository outside of the staging directory. We are back at top level. Plugin. What? No, that's not what I want. The other button was yellow. It used to be that some of the things in Kubernetes were plugins. This is actually a little bit of surprising. Admission and auth used to be plugins and not their own thing. They're their own thing now, but some of the stuff lives still in the plugin folder. So if we go and look at the plugin folder, you will find a thing that's actually, here we are. Some of these things should look familiar. Always pull images. You know, like when your image goes stale and for some reason your thing won't ship because it can't find the Docker image because the pod is not pulling the image with the changes. It's still broken. You're like, why is it broken? I'm shipping the thing. And then you set always pull images to true. This is where that code lives. So this is another interesting one. It's still under plugins. So node restriction, 4 days ago, 10 days ago. I always like looking at what happened about the most recent changes, right? I like to look at the dates. If something says 3 years ago was the last change on this, I'm like, yeah, okay. I'm not even sure. Either it's working really, really well and doesn't need changes, or it's not being used right now. So, back to the staging folder. We already talked about the API, and I can give you brief overviews. So, recap, a lot of the stuff that used to live in package now lives in staging, but it's not top level. In the publishing folder is all the logic where we keep all the mirror repos in sync. So that's a lot of automation instrumentation. You go to source, and then you go to K8s.io. Is anyone unfamiliar with K8s? Nope, we're good? Okay. Short for Kubernetes, pronounced K8s, pronounced Kubernetes. Both are correct. We talked about the API folder. API extensions API server is the place where logic for CRDs lives. This is where you would go to find custom resource definitions. Let's go ahead. I don't want to tell you the wrong thing, so let me just reference my notes. Here we are. Cool. So in API machinery and API server, these two folders are actually related. This is where the logic lives that makes the API work. So here's a whole nother package folder. More APIs. But this is where the actual logic lives and not the registration and the definition. Let's go back. So API server is related to that. CLI runtime. This actually has generic helpers for Kubernetes-related CLI tools. They actually have a README, I believe. Boom. Kubectl commands, Kubectl plugins. If any one of you has ever used Kustomize, Kustomize started out as a kubectl plugin. Actually, it started out as its own subcommand, but then now it's part of kubectl. We already talked about client Go. Cloud provider. I believe this is another one of the historic repos. So is cluster bootstrap. Those are like, we wanted to have cloud provider specific code. We want to have cluster provisioning code. Code generator is a place where a lot of the logic lives that generates, that auto-generates the API definitions inside the repository. We can talk a little bit more about that in detail in person, but I want to continue with the overall overview. Component base was an attempt to clean up and refactor, and it's an ongoing attempt. So it's basically trying to make sure that we don't have so many definitions of so many different things in all the same place. This might be a good place to get involved if you are very familiar with Kubernetes objects and want to help do some cleanup. Let's see, where are we at? We talked about these, talked about code generator, component base. CRI API, this one has to do with container runtime. CSI translation lib is container storage interface related. Storage is one of the things that I am very much not familiar with because where I work, we don't store things on our clusters. We don't keep state. But a lot of people do, and a lot of people do really cool work on it. And if this is you, here is some of that code. Kube aggregator. This one is actually a helper for you when you have custom resource definitions and also the regular Kubernetes API. This is the code that lets your API server pretend that it's all one and the same thing, so that you don't have to have separate parallel processes going on for both. So this one's pretty cool. Yes, question?
Architecture diagram or something which has all these components in one place. Like we can map which layer they are at, or that way it will be a lot easier to remember. Sounds like a great first issue.
Yeah, so there are Kubernetes diagrams. And I may be able to find you something. The problem with it is it goes out of date pretty fast. So yeah. And yes, there are diagrams, but they are really hard to keep up to date. But that's a really good question, and I don't have one for you today. But get in touch with me, and I might be able to find something for you. All right. Where were we? Okay. So, whoopsies, that was not at all what I meant to do. The next few folders have to do with kubeproxy, kubescheduler, kubecontrol, things that you're all really fairly familiar with it. And when I first gave this presentation, the kubecontrol code all lived under the package folder. And now most of it is in the staging directory. We have some legacy cloud providers. One thing I want to mention about this folder that is really the most important thing are the last 3 of these: sample API server, sample CLI plugin, and sample controller. What these are well-maintained example repositories that make it possible for you. These are tutorials, basically. They're very technical tutorials, and they are unfortunately buried really far down in this directory. But they are some of the most useful places that you can get started hacking and building. They are frequently updated, and they will show you if you want to build an extension API server, if you want to build custom resource definitions. It's well documented, well maintained, and you should be able to use all 3 of these right out of the box, and you will learn a lot about how this works by trying it out and playing with it. So that is my recommendation to you. We are almost done, and that is good because we are almost at lunch. Back to the top. So we talked about the most exciting places in the entire repository. Most of the meat and potatoes is done. There's a couple more folders. There's the test folder, which has a lot of the integration tests in it. Most of our test infrastructure lives in Kubernetes/test infra. So you'd go here. So when you open your first pull request, a bot will talk to you. And who here has heard of Prow? Prow is a really great open source project. Kubernetes is not actually the only one that uses Prow. Prow is how we manage our pull request workflow. Prow is how we put labels and SIGs and assign reviewers in an org where we don't get to click buttons and assign humans with like a mouse click. I will give you a little overview of where these commands live at the end of today, this afternoon. But this is where the Prow code lives. Prow is also responsible for merging your pull request. If you gathered all your pull request labels and everything looks good and you got all the reviews and you have all the green flags and all the tests pass and your pull request is just kind of sitting there and there's no button that says merge now, the reason is because Prow is waiting, and in this case it's actually a sub-command of Prow called Tide. Tide is waiting in a merge pool and your pull request is queued to get merged. Someone's laughing. Yes, these are all maritime themes. I'm not sorry. The idea is that the tide takes your pull request and washes it into Kubernetes. So, all right. We are back on Kubernetes top level. This was test. And then third-party code is mostly kind of like vendor, but in a different place for legal reasons and licensing reasons. Most of the time, you're not going to have to worry about this. Translations. This is actually about human translations into other languages. So if you want to translate docs, if you want to add things, here's some examples. If this is you, if you're tired of all the English-centricness in computer programming. Vendor. Some versions of Kubernetes still use Go before Go modules were a thing. This is that. This is literally a Go vendor code. We have a couple of Git files, and then we have a ton of changelog files, a license, a make file, a top-level owners file. I actually wonder who's in there. Some of these people should look familiar. Tim Hawken, Brendan Burns. All right. Do we have any questions before we head out to lunch? Because this is the last of the core repository, and now it is lunchtime. Questions? Yes,
So, yeah, I'm sorry.
There's a-
I'm just thinking of, staging and not staging. Oh, thank you.
yes.
So at the end of the day, you would do your work under staging, and then you would reference your work from below staging, above staging, right?
So all the mirror repositories, that happens automatically. If you will do changes in the staging repository as of this day, yes.
Okay.
I'm not sure that was your question, though.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, yeah.
I think his question was, where should you stage your changes for your pull request? Right?
No. I was really, the question was really, if I need to change something in the place, let's do that in staging.
Do it in staging or in package. It depends.
Yeah. It depends on the project that I'm touching, right?
Yes, it absolutely depends on where the current code is, and sometimes it's literally in two places because it's being moved over. So, yeah. All right, let's go eat.